You ever have that moment where something you take for granted, like running water, suddenly disappears, and the reason isn't a broken pipe or a city maintenance crew, but your neighbor, using it for their own backyard pool? That was me, Alex Rivers, standing in my kitchen one morning, coffee in hand, staring at my faucet that barely dribbled a drop. I frowned, blinked, and reached for the water meter outside. At first, I thought it must be some technical glitch. Maybe the city was doing maintenance, maybe a leak, but the meter told a different story. It was spinning like crazy, nonstop, almost like a carnival ride I didn't want to be on. And then I saw it. My private water line had been diverted, connected, pumping straight into my neighbor's luxury pool. That pool, the one I'd seen during HOA meetings, sparkling, pristine, costing more than my house. And every drop was coming from my property, my water, my bills. I just stood there for a moment, blinked a few times, sipped coffee, stared at Baxter, my golden retriever, who was tilting his head like he could sense my rising panic. "You're seeing this, right?" I muttered. He wagged his tail, unimpressed, but I could swear he knew. I went over and knocked on the neighbor's door first. Polite, reasonable. "Hey, I think my water line is being used for your pool. Could you please stop?" The response: smirks, a casual laugh, and, "Oh, Alex, it's just a little water. You won't even notice it." Not notice it. I was literally standing in my kitchen faucet, watching it barely flow while their pool bubbled like it was some private resort. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to cry. Mostly, I wanted to turn a valve right then and there. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with documenting everything. Photos of the meter readings, timestamps, diagrams of the piping, even some aerial shots with a drone to track the diversion. I was turning into a little suburban water detective. Every night I'd pace the kitchen, coffee in hand, Baxter circling my feet, mentally rehearsing what I could do. Polite emails? Ignored. HOA complaints? Dismissed. Warning notes? Tossed aside. It was like trying to get a stubborn cat to move. Finally, I called a plumber to confirm what I suspected. Sure enough, my line had been tapped illegally. But the good news? There was a valve, fully accessible, that I could legally operate. I could control the flow safely, stop unauthorized use, and protect my property. That was it. The plan formed in my mind like a slow crescendo in a movie score, precise, legal, and satisfying. I spent the next week preparing for the water showdown. I measured valves, mapped out flow rates, documented legal references, and printed signs. Private water line, unauthorized use will be controlled. Bright red letters, impossible to miss. Baxter sat beside me during planning sessions, tail wagging like he approved. I double-checked everything. What if they called the HOA? What if they called a lawyer? Every precaution was in place. Meanwhile, the neighbor continued filling that pool like nothing was wrong. I watched from my kitchen window, trying not to shout across the fence. I imagined them floating lazily on noodles, oblivious to the fact that their luxury lifestyle was draining my water. Each bubble in the pool felt like a personal affront. And the more they ignored me, the more my plan crystallized. This wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity, boundaries, and taking control of what was mine. I also rehearsed what I'd say during the confrontation. Calm, firm, direct. This is my water line. Unauthorized use will not continue. You have options, and now you must respect boundaries. I even considered recording video, documenting every step in case the neighbors tried to argue later. Everything had to be legal, precise, and unassailable. The night before I executed the plan, I barely slept. Pacing the kitchen, coffee in hand, Baxter snoring at my feet, I reviewed my notes. Timing, valve operation, documentation, communication, everything had to go exactly as planned. A misstep and the story could turn into a legal headache instead of a lesson learned. Yet there was excitement, almost giddy, in the air. After weeks of ignored warnings and stolen water, I felt like a general about to command a perfectly executed operation. By dawn, the morning was crisp. Sunlight caught the water shimmering in the neighbor's pool, sparkling in the early light, mocking me almost. Baxter wagged his tail, ready. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and inspected the valve one last time. Everything in place. Signs visible, documentation ready, legal precautions checked. Today, the message would be delivered. Not angrily, not vindicatively, just clearly, decisively. My water, my property, my rules. And if they wanted to learn a lesson, It was about to happen. I took a deep breath, ran my fingers over the valve, imagining the moment when I'd turn it and they'd realize the consequences of ignoring boundaries. It wasn't about punishment, it was about respect. Respect for law, for property, for common sense. And maybe a little satisfaction for weeks of frustration, ignored requests, and watching a sparkling pool fill with water that wasn't theirs. Today, boundaries would be reinforced. Today, justice, suburban, practical, and perfectly legal, would flow. The morning of what I started calling Water Payback Day arrived crisp and clear. I woke up early, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and stepped outside onto my property. Baxter, my golden retriever, bounded ahead, tail wagging, as if he knew something monumental was about to happen. The neighbor's pool gleamed in the sunlight, sparkling and perfectly still, mocking me silently. I took a deep breath, checked my notes one last time, and walked to the valve I had meticulously prepared the week before. I glanced around, making sure no one suspicious was watching. The bright red warning signs were posted along the water line. Private water line. Unauthorized use will be controlled. Every letter visible, every sign in place. I had also documented flow rates and water meter readings, just in case someone tried to argue later. Baxter sat at my side, panting lightly, and I swear he seemed to nod as I whispered, "Today, buddy, boundaries are about to be reinforced." By 8:30 a.m., I heard the faint clatter of the neighbor's gate opening. Megan, the HOA president, appeared, carrying a clipboard, sunglasses on, clearly expecting a normal sunny morning by the pool. I took another sip of coffee, and then I went for it. I turned the valve. Slowly, deliberately, feeling every click, every shift of pressure. The water in the pool slowed. The jets sputtered. The surface rippled, and then fell eerily still. The first reaction came almost immediately. A scream from the backyard. "What the hell?" I smiled faintly, watching through the fence as Megan's hand flew to her forehead. Her precious pool, filled at my expense, was suddenly stagnant. I leaned on the fence, calm, measured, holding Baxter's leash loosely. "Hi, Megan," I said sweetly. "I think we need to discuss property lines." She spun around, glare sharp, voice sharp. "Alex, what are you doing?" "You can't." I raised a hand. "Actually, yes, I can. Private water line. Unauthorized usage. Legal. Enjoy your morning." Her jaw dropped, and I swear I could see the panic flicker across her face. For weeks, she had treated my property as a free resource. Today, she realized boundaries exist and consequences follow. The neighbor in the blue villa next door, who had also been siphoning water, ran out screaming, "Why is my pool not filling?" I leaned casually against the fence. "You'll have to check the signs. Private line. Unauthorized usage will be controlled. Legally. Enjoy figuring it out." I couldn't help but feel a thrill. Baxter barked happily as if to punctuate the statement. Throughout the morning, reactions were a mix of frantic yelling, confused faces, and frantic phone calls. Megan tried to call the HOA, but I had anticipated that. Documentation ready. Meter readings. Photos. Diagrams. I was untouchable. Each scream, each frantic gesture, only reinforced my satisfaction. And yes, I was calm, polite, almost annoyingly serene while the chaos unfolded around me. I even added a little theatricality. I walked slowly along the water line, checking pressure, tapping the valve, glancing at the neighbors, speaking softly but clearly. Unauthorized use is paused. Legal compliance is now necessary. Their expressions went from disbelief to anger to sheepish acknowledgement. One of the board members, Tom, tried to argue that it was guest use. I leaned over the fence and said, "Tom, the signs, the law, and your repeated trespass say otherwise. Enjoy your pool without my water." "Oh wait, you can't." It got better when a few HOA members attempted to troubleshoot. They were fiddling with hoses, trying to bypass my valve, muttering, "It's just a little water. How bad can it be?" I walked over, hands raised, and said, "Actually, it's entirely blocked. Fully compliant with local ordinances. Any tampering could be considered further trespass. Have fun." Baxter barked once, like a referee confirming the score. By midday, the neighborhood had gathered. People walking dogs, kids peeking over fences, even casual walkers slowed down to witness the spectacle. Some laughed, some shook their heads, some whispered to each other, Did he really do that? I watched, calm, sipping my second cup of coffee, letting the chaos unfold. The pool jets sputtered, neighbors gesticulated, HOA members argued among themselves. And through it all, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction, relief, and even amusement. There were tense moments, of course. At one point, Megan tried to argue for a compromise. Fine, just a few gallons. I smiled. Sorry, water flow is fully under my control. Unauthorized usage is now paused. Legally, enjoy your swim without it. She went red, muttering, pacing, realizing the entire operation was precise, legal, and unavoidable. Even the casual neighbors seemed entertained. One kid leaned over the fence and whispered to his friend, "He's actually doing it." That's insane. A dog barked in the background, chasing a squirrel, providing comedic relief to the scene. Baxter seemed particularly proud, circling the valve, tail wagging. By mid-afternoon, the water meter confirmed it. 0 gallons were flowing to unauthorized pools. The HOA board and Megan were left with frantic phone calls, arguments, and a little humiliation. I stayed calm, leaned on the fence, and documented everything. Legal, meticulous, and perfectly executed. Every step planned in advance had worked flawlessly. The final act of the day came when Megan attempted a direct confrontation. "Alex, you can't just..." I held up my hands, calm, almost serene. "Actually, yes, I can. Fully legal, fully documented. My property, my water, my rules." Lesson delivered. She stared at me, mouth open, fists clenched, realizing she had been outmaneuvered not by anger, but by strategy. By the end of the day, the lesson had landed. The pool jets were off, the water flow halted, and the message was clear. Unauthorized use of private property comes with consequences. Baxter and I walked the length of my property, inspecting the valve, watching the calm settle over the neighborhood. A few neighbors gave subtle nods, acknowledging the precision of the day's events. I reflected on it then. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't petty. It was about boundaries, property rights, and knowing how to assert them effectively, legally, and decisively. And, if I'm honest, it was also slightly fun to watch the realization hit those who had been abusing my resources for weeks. By evening, the sun was low, casting golden light over my yard. Baxter rolled in the grass, happy and unconcerned. The pools in the neighborhood were still, silent, a monument to boundaries respected. The HOA was still muttering, still shaking their heads, but they'd learned a lesson in a way that words, emails, and warnings never could. As I closed the valve for the last time and sipped my third cup of coffee, I felt a strange satisfaction. Calm, methodical, legal, but unforgettable. Sometimes, asserting your rights requires a little strategy, a little patience, and a little creativity. And if it teaches a lesson along the way, well, that's just the icing on the cake. The morning after what I started calling Water Payback Day, Pinecrest Heights felt strangely quiet. The usual buzz of pool jets, sprinklers, and garden hoses was missing. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and for the first time in weeks, my water line was flowing normally, uninterrupted. Baxter bounded ahead, sniffing every inch of the yard, tail wagging, like he too was savoring the calm after the storm. I walked along the property, checking the signs I had posted. Private water line. Unauthorized use will be controlled. Each one bright, clear, impossible to ignore. Every neighbor had seen them, and by now, everyone knew the consequences of trying to divert my water. Megan, the HOA president, and her board had received a full demonstration of what happens when you ignore boundaries, laws, and common sense. As the sun climbed, I noticed subtle shifts in the neighborhood. People were peeking out of windows, whispering over fences. Some smiled at me knowingly. Others shook their heads in disbelief. A few even waved. I could almost hear the collective thought. He actually did it, and legally. The pools that had been bubbling and full the day before were now silent, half-filled, a visual reminder of respect earned. Megan eventually came out, clipboard in hand, pacing the edge of her lawn. Her expression was a mix of frustration and reluctant respect. She attempted a few calls, probably to lawyers, the HOA, and anyone she could think of to reverse what had happened. I stayed back, calm, coffee in hand, and said nothing. Every frustrated shout and frantic phone call was confirmation that my planning, documentation, and patience had worked. Emails started trickling in later that day, from HOA members and a few neighbors. Some were polite inquiries. We need to discuss what happened. Others were veiled complaints. This was excessive. I responded carefully, concisely. Private water line. Unauthorized use was halted legally. No further discussion required. Simple, factual, and untouchable. Every photo, meter reading, diagram, and signed notice backed up my response. By midweek, the story had spread beyond just our street. Local blogs picked up the water payback saga, neighbors shared video clips online, and comments ranged from legendary to "Is this even legal?" A few HOA members contacted me privately. Some were apologetic, some begrudgingly impressed, and a few were just plain bewildered. Megan herself sent a brief email suggesting a mediation meeting, probably hoping it would smooth over the embarrassment. I replied simply, "Property boundaries respected. Lesson delivered." The best part wasn't even the halted pools or the shocked HOA board. It was watching the subtle changes in behavior afterward. Board members no longer assumed access to my water. Guests or contractors were hesitant to even approach the valve. Even casual neighbors now read the signs carefully. My water, my property, my rules, finally respected without confrontation or further escalation. Baxter and I spent afternoons reclaiming the space fully. I sat in a lawn chair at the edge of my property, sipping coffee, letting him sniff and chase squirrels freely. The tension from the previous weeks had lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of control and satisfaction. The water line flowed steadily, uninterrupted, a silent victory. Of course, Megan and her board weren't going to vanish entirely. There were still muttered complaints, whispered conversations over fences, occasional passive-aggressive notes left on doors. But the lesson had landed. Boundaries exist, and ignoring them carries consequences. And this time, the consequence was crystal clear, measured, and entirely legal. Reflecting on the event, I realized it wasn't about revenge or petty satisfaction. It was about asserting rights, establishing boundaries, and enforcing them thoughtfully. Weeks of frustration, ignored requests, and unauthorized water usage had led to a legal, calculated, and undeniable action. And that action sent a message far louder than any complaint email could have. The calm evenings afterward were almost surreal. Baxter rolled in the grass. I checked the meter readings, and the pools that had once sucked water from my property were now still. Some neighbors nodded or smiled when we passed each other. Others looked wary, realizing that the property line and the water line were no joke. I couldn't help but chuckle. Justice had a way of being oddly satisfying, especially when executed thoughtfully. By the weekend, Megan had given up trying to reverse the events. Emails quieted, phone calls stopped, and the HOA board had finally adjusted their behavior. The lesson had been learned in a way that was visible, undeniable, and oddly entertaining. I even caught a few neighbors joking quietly to each other, "Don't mess with Alex's water line." I smiled, knowing that boundaries, once respected, are rarely challenged again. And that's the thing I hope everyone watching takes away from this story. Protecting your property isn't just about yelling or fighting. It's about planning, knowledge, and strategy. Knowing your rights, documenting carefully, and taking precise, legal action can solve problems more effectively than weeks of frustration or polite warnings. And yes, a little creativity and humor helps make sure the lesson sticks. So here's my question for you, the viewer. What would you do if a neighbor siphoned water from your property to fill a pool, irrigate a lawn, or just for fun? Would you call the HOA? Send emails? Plan your own payback legally? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was what I did justified? Too much? Or the perfect response to a ridiculous situation? Because at the end of the day, this story isn't just about a private water line or a fancy pool. It's about asserting rights, enforcing boundaries, and showing that ordinary people, when patient, strategic, and creative, can protect what's theirs. And that's a lesson worth sharing and discussing.